This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Thank you all very much. If those of you at the back could come forward and take some seats up here, we can get proceedings underway. Just give people a moment. There's plenty, well, there aren't plenty, but there are some seats here at the front. So please feel free to come forward. My name is Alex White, Director General here at the Institute, and delighted to welcome you all this afternoon for the first event of our Rethink Energy series of 2025, a series that, as in the past, is sponsored by the ESB, Ireland's state-owned electricity company, amongst other things. And we're really thrilled to renew our collaboration and cooperation with ESB, always very fruitful, certainly from the Institute's point of view, and I hope and I think also from the ESB's point of view. It's the fourth such series that we've run. We also have had three very successful conferences, full-blown conferences, including one last year. 2019, 2022, and 2024, we held those Accelerate conferences. It's, I suppose, with the pandemic and various other factors, the first ESB IEA partnership event that we've held as a fully face-to-face as well. Well, we also have hybrid, of course, with an opportunity for people to take part and to view it online, but we're able to be back here fully in person, or to use the more common phrases used now, face-to-face rather than in person, here in Northway, Georgia Street. So a very warm welcome to you all. I welcome, obviously in particular, our distinguished speaker and guest, Brian Motherway. I'll say more about him in a few minutes. I welcome the Norwegian ambassador. Very welcome here this afternoon. His Excellency Aslak Brun. The chairman of the ESB, Terence O'Rourke, well known to us. Welcome to him. Welcome, if I may say so, in particular to Eamon Ryan, Foreign Minister Eamon Ryan. Delighted to see you here again. I know you're an old friend of the Institute, and it's terrific to have you back here again, as I say, face-to-face and in person. We're really looking forward to an interesting session with Brian Motherway. But before I hand over to Brian, I'd like to invite Sharon McManus, who's Group Head of Sustainability at ESB, to say a few words of introduction. You're welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to you all. So as Alex said, my name is Sharon McManus, and I'm the Group Head of Sustainability at ESB, and I have the honour of saying a few introductory words before I hand over to Brian. What a better way to begin this series of the Rethink Energy Lectures, an initiative between ESB and IIEA, than to have our eminent guest speaker, Brian Motherway. I leave the formal introduction to Alex in terms of who and what Brian is, but I'm sure everyone in the room is really looking forward to his insights on the last 10 years since the Paris Agreement. And I want to thank everyone here in the room and online for being with us here today. I knew Brian many years ago when he was still head of strategy in SAAI, and I was a young army captain launching an energy management strategy at the time, based on the owner's public sector targets that Eamon introduced at the time, which really catalysed so much work. And this community is very small and very engaged, and there's a lot of overlaps between everyone in this room and online in this space. And I think there's a huge amount to be learned from all of us in the room. And as I said, the insights from Brian will be really insightful soon. But a few words maybe in terms of some of the ESB perspectives, if I may. We are in a very fast-moving world at the moment, and a period of huge amount of complexity and uncertainty, as we are all experiencing at the moment. And in many ways, 2015 seems like the good old days. We still had 28 member states in the European Union. Donald Trump was a reality TV star. And unless you had a medical degree, you didn't know what coronavirus was. And also in 2015, there was a clear demonstration of the importance of climate action and interest from global leaders. Certainly, we are living in a very different world now. We have been through a pandemic, we have been through an energy crisis, and I would say that the arc of instability that always surrounded Europe has now found its way onto our European continent and becoming ever more pressing matter. And so the conversation around climate action and climate change is now competing with security and defence, cost competitiveness, and resource scarcity issues. And we cannot lose sight of this. When it comes to the science, however, there is no escaping the fact that climate change is happening and global warming is happening. In Ireland and in Europe, we have very specific and onerous targets to reach net zero by mid-century. And DSB have very specific targets, which we are very much committed to reach net zero by 2040. We know that the investment in climate change, climate action, and in energy is not a zero-sum game. And if we can reduce our reliance on imported fossil fuels, not just for Ireland, but in Europe as well, we ensure stability, security, and cost competitiveness for all consumers. We know as an island nation that national security is inextricably linked with energy security, which is inextricably linked with economic security. The good news is that huge progress has been made. And although some of the rhetoric can sometimes find its way into the negative space, there are huge positives to be noticed and to be reminded of today. And we spoke about some of those before this around our lunch table, which were really, really interesting. But just because the pace of change in the past was so does not mean that the pace of change in the future will be so, because we have to capitalize on the education, the innovation, the investment and the technological developments that have been happening over the last decade or so. A couple of data points. Over a 5-year period between 2018 and 2023, although there has been a net increase in energy demand, there has been a 30% reduction in carbon intensity in this country. Since 2021, the volume of renewables in our grid, the capacity now actually exceeds the peak demand of energy in this country. That is no mean feat. And from close to a standing start only a few years ago, Ireland now has over 1.5 gigawatts of solar renewable energy installed, including over 100,000 of micro renewable energy connections. This is a 10-fold increase since 2020. These are achievements that we should acknowledge and we should build upon and we should capitalize upon. And these successes are down to a huge national collective effort, politically, at company level, at civil service level, and at the industry level, and the average consumer and the average homeowner and citizen of this country. Everyone has their part to play. At the same time, we cannot ignore the real challenges ahead, the ones that we are facing every day at the moment. There are planning challenges, there are supply chain challenges, there are affordability concerns. And there are also, I suppose, some barriers to adopting electrification in terms of heat and transport which have to be overcome. But these are simply challenges and obstacles which we will get through and we will get around. We are particularly committed to 3 strategic objectives in ESB. The first of these is decarbonising our electricity generation. The second is building a resilient grid. The third is empowering our customers. And we will do this using our foundational capability of being sustainable and socially responsible. And these aren't words just on a page. This means building offshore wind farms, building more substations, encouraging customers and empowering them to become prosumers as opposed to just consumers in the future. And ensuring that we do this by examining our supply chains, not just because we want to have a secure supply of the raw materials required to do this, but also because we are concerned about human rights within our supply chain also. This is a huge undertaking and we are committed to those strategic objectives. The optimism underpinning the Paris Agreement at the time may seem a little bit distant now, and we will hear more from Brian's perspective in a moment in terms of how progress is going to be maintained into the future. But our targets remain intact, and our commitment to achieving those targets remains intact. Because ultimately, as I said, net zero is not just about climate change, it's not just about cost competitiveness, and it's not just about industrial imperatives. It's also about laying the foundations for a resilient energy secure, economically secure, and nationally secure Ireland. I'll hand you over now to Alex to introduce Brian. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Sharon. Brian Motherway is head of the Office of Energy Efficiency and Inclusive Transitions at the International Energy Agency. In this role, he oversees analytical and outreach programs supporting energy efficiency globally. He also leads IEA's work with governments on people-centered policymaking, addressing issues such as skills, inclusion, and fairness in clean energy policies. Before he joined the IEA, Brian was Chief Executive of the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland. I knew him during that period. He was extremely supportive to me as a minister and a great mentor, a great expert, a great giver of advice, and someone that one could really rely on for expertise. And I know he was certainly, to coin an old cliche, he was the IEA's gain, but very much the country's loss and the SEAI's loss at the time. I know many of us felt that keenly, but we were delighted that he went on to do so much important, critical work on the international, at the scale that he has been able to do that. Brian has always struck me as a particularly suited person for the kind of role that he carries out. Because, you know, when we talk about this whole energy space and discourse and world, we think about the engineering skills that are so important and so necessary, understanding capacity, understanding what's necessary in relation to infrastructure. But we also think about and are conscious of the importance of discussion, public debate, attitudes. We were talking earlier over lunch, optimism versus pessimism, how people think, how people look at the future, how they understand their own world. So instead of, as well as I should say, being an engineer and a highly qualified engineer, Brian Motherway is also holds a PhD in sociology. So he in fact straddles two critically important fields in this entire area of discussion and change and transition. So as I've always thought, he is especially well qualified to work in this area and to address us this afternoon. So it's my very great pleasure to welcome Brian to the stage. And those of you in the room will be able to ask questions afterwards. And those of you watching us online can do so using Q&A on Zoom. Brian, over to you. Thank you very much.
It was worth coming just with all those compliments. I can go home now. Well, thank you, Alex. Thank you very much. Thanks to the IIEA, and thank you, Sharon. It's great to see you again. I remember traipsing around barracks maybe quite some years ago, and it's great to see your leadership continues now in the ESB. And Terence, you made a good choice there. So, and thank you for the ESB for hosting this event. And for me, it's a great pleasure to be back in North Great Jordan Street. I used to come here quite a lot back in the day with Brendan and other colleagues. We used to have really interesting discussions. And in fact, I left Ireland to move to Paris literally the week of this commencement of COP21. And so it's really nice to come back and reflect on what is just almost exactly a decade since COP21 did something historic. And the question is, what has happened since then? But really, I want to focus in on what's next when we reflect on what's happened in the last decade. And first of all, let's not underestimate the progress. The amount of investment now going into clean energy. In 2024, the total amount of investment in the energy system went over $3 trillion equivalent for the first time, and $2 trillion of that was in clean energy plus infrastructure. So, and it's several years now that we've seen this flip, this divergence in the directions of travel between clean energy and fossil energy, and the amount of investment only continues to grow. And we see then manifesting on the ground what is actually happening. We see heat pumps growing in record numbers in Europe, but also globally. This year, 1 in 2 new cars sold in China will be an electric vehicle of some sort. That will be maybe 1 in 4 in Europe, 1 in 5 totally on the planet. And Ireland has had many successes here, whether it's the penetration of wind, solar, batteries, great success in terms of retrofit and energy efficiency. And what I want to stress here, this isn't just about abstract numbers, but this is what is, first of all, it's what's becoming normal on the ground. And also much of it is beyond policy, if I can put it that way, in terms of what is now the cheapest technology, the preferred choice for consumers. Policy has brought it to where it is now, and it now exists in itself. And I think that will be very important. Having said some of the good news bits, there's a bottom line here, which is emissions are going up. And they continue to go up. In 2024, they went up by about 0.8%. Energy use spiked a little bit in growth in 2024. It went up by about 2.3%, which was higher than the previous couple of years. Electricity grew by twice as fast as energy systems as a whole. We are seeing electrification, which is a good thing, and we'll talk about that. Ironically, the biggest driver of electricity growth last year was the increasing use of air conditioning because the world is getting hotter. So, but we do see some really important shifts as well in terms of where that's happening. So we saw the advanced economies in recent years were actually seeing declines in their energy use. That reversed in 2024. China has been the driver of global energy and emissions growth in the last few years. That's still true, but by not as much last year. And we also see, on the one hand, really strong progress in terms of, let's say, our ability to run our economies in terms of carbon and energy, but being overwhelmed by growth. So here in advanced economies, in OECD countries, it takes 1/3 as much carbon to generate a unit of GDP as it did 50 years ago. But when you compare that to global growth in the OECD and more globally, it's just being overwhelmed. And what we see is an upward graph, and we are way, way off our targets in terms of emissions, in terms of 1.5, in terms of the commitments that every country on the planet made 10 years ago in COP21. We haven't really even started that journey in terms of where we need to be. Having said that, in terms of electricity growth, I do want to say that 80% of the capacity additions around the world to the electricity system were clean in one sort or the other. And we do see that major trend. And as I say, in terms of the optimism, pessimism framing, I'm going to say all the ingredients are there. Everything is there for us to go on the next leg of the journey. And it's a question of some of the choices we make now. When I talk about energy investments going up and clean energy investments going up, there's a very grave asymmetry going on here. 85% of investment in clean energy happens in the US, the EU, and China. And the rest of the world is a relatively minor player. Despite their need for energy solutions, despite their growing energy systems and the need for people to have access to clean and reliable energy, and despite the simple transactional equation that where is the cheapest carbon, where is the more sunlight, where is the more opportunities for abating carbon, there's a real mismatch between where investment is currently flowing and where it needs to flow in the future. Equally, we'll be talking quite a bit here about fairness in transitions and who benefits and who doesn't benefit and things like that. But today's energy global system is fundamentally inequitable in terms of access to energy. 760 million people around the world have no access to electricity. 2.3 billion people are still cooking with traditional fuels that are polluting. In sub-Saharan Africa, there are 500,000 premature deaths every year, primarily among women and girls because of their exposure to indoor pollutants associated with traditional ways of cooking. In advanced economies, here in the EU, 40 million people are in energy poverty. Poor households pay far more of their income on energy despite using less energy. In emerging economies, it's actually the graph is a bit misleading because poorer households spend less and consume less because they have access to less. So we have real fundamental inequalities in today's energy system that are our starting point. And then, of course, as have been alluded to already, we're in a particular moment, which is where I want to focus on in terms of where we've got to over the last decade and where we need to go. And I think there are a lot of headwinds. First of all, even before recent elections and things like that, we saw much more pushback. We are seeing much more pushback in every election in Europe, in Australia, in Canada, in the US, wherever you want to look, in Costa Rica, in Colombia, in terms of the way people feel about the effects on their lives of clean energy policies, the political opportunism that goes with that, which is inevitable. And as we discussed, a lot of this change in the politics of clean energy is normal. as transitions become more real and grounded, when I start to feel on the ground that my life is changing, or I'm being asked to change, or somebody's telling me something's going to happen, it just makes it more political. It makes it more divisive, and it makes it open to becoming more of a political debate. And of course, that's all a bit on steroids in 2025 in terms of the changes in geopolitics, the changes in some key positions, which I'm sure we'll talk about. So I want to talk a bit about how I see what the response needs to look like in terms of keeping us on track or getting us back on track. And my central thesis here will be around, to relate it to some of the work that I'll be telling you about that we're doing. We use the term people-centered clean energy transitions. And my starting point in all these discussions is transitions are not about tons of carbon. They're not about megawatt hours. They're not about batteries. They're about people. We are engaged in clean energy transitions to make people's lives better in terms of greater energy access, affordability for the right amount of energy to keep people's lives comfortable, to drive economies, to create jobs, reduce air pollution, reduce the most egregious effects of climate change. And I think, to be frank, sometimes we forget that, and we end up in technical conversations about particular policies, particular technologies, and we forget the orientation towards the social, which I think is a real key moment for us right now. And I'll be talking about three themes in that I think are central. First of all is the importance of leading with a positive vision when we talk about clean energy transitions. The second is creating social facts on the ground. And the third is designing our policies with fairness front and foremost in our mind. And first of all, let me talk about that, the way we frame it, and we talk about the why of clean energy transitions and what we're doing them for and what we expect from people that we're engaging with. I'm just going to take one example of 1,000 possibilities in terms of the framing of these debates. And this is the London ultra-low emission zones, which have been in place for a number of years now, which basically means it's harder to drive a car in London. There's greater access for buses. Cars have to meet certain pollution standards, et cetera, et cetera. In a ramp up of these a year or two ago, there was tremendous pushback. These are some of the many headlines. A lot of people who whether they're in the media or in civil society, suddenly having an interest in poor people that I don't remember hearing before in terms of the effects it was going to have on the poorer communities. They would suffer the most, it would cost them the most, they wouldn't be able to get around, and that was how unfair the policy was. This is actually the reality of the policy in London. Air has got dramatically better in quality terms for everybody, and in particular, the reason I like showing this graph is that the gap between the richest and the poorest communities has closed by half. So everybody benefits from these policies, and poorer communities benefit in particular. And of course, it turns out that poorer communities are the people who rely most on buses. And now that buses can move freer, now that public transport is better, now there's more pedestrianization, ability to cycle, all of that is benefiting the people who need those benefits the most. And as I say, this is just one of many examples I could have cited to say the difference between the rhetoric and the reality. And I think we see this all the time. We definitely see it here in Ireland. We see it in elections in many countries in recent years, where somehow we have allowed the equation to be, on the one hand, it's going to cost us more, it's going to be inconvenient, I'm not going to be allowed to do something I used to be allowed to do, it's going to change my way of life, whether I like it or not. And on the other hand, some abstract future target, Brussels is telling us to do it, it'll be good for the planet in 100 years. And you have this real divergence between the tangible reality of the downsides and the abstractness of the future. And some of that is part of the equation, but it's no framing to motivate people, it's no framing to excite people, it's no framing to get people to engage in things that really have to be debated. We have societal choices to make that are really important. And of course, that framing is not the reality. And let me give an example from here in Ireland. Ireland has many, many excellent energy efficiency programs, and this one is targeted on the poorest and the most needy, because this is a program run by a fantastic institution called SEAI that is actually linked up here with medical professionals to target people. And basically, putting it simply, it's retrofit by prescription. So doctors find people who are suffering in damp, cold homes, and they prescribe a retrofit of the home. SEAI comes along and pays for that, improves the home. This is from part of that pilot in Dublin, where about 1,600 homes were upgraded, and people were asked on a scale of 0 to 5, what has changed? And you can see for yourselves there, difficulty in paying bills has plummeted, GP visits have plummeted, hospitalization has halved, and thermal comfort has gone from 1 to 5. And that's the reality. That's what clean energy looks like on the ground. And that's what a clean energy policy needs to look like. When you ask somebody now, have you ever heard of net zero? Have you heard of clean energy? They're probably going to think about, oh, is that the thing where I can't do X? You're going to ban my boiler. You're going to increase my energy costs. But actually in Ireland, clean energy policies are healthier, more comfortable homes. They're better rural bus services. They're jobs in wind energy. They're cleaner environments. They're opportunities for the future. And we need to hang on to that framing. And that's why I talk about leading with a positive vision. But of course, there are costs and benefits. Not everything is just pure benefits. Some people will see costs. Some people will see changes they don't necessarily welcome. And we need to embrace that and we need to engage that. And that's why I think the question of fairness is so important when we design and implement our policies. And this is an example from a French retrofit program, not dissimilar from ones in Ireland and elsewhere. And the yellow bars tell us that if you just gave retrofit grants to home owners that are on a flat rate, you get 30% of the cost or whatever else. The richer deciles on the right would, for understandable reasons, get most of the money involved. But in the French case, they designed a more nuanced scheme that takes a number of factors into account in terms of the state of the house, the size of the family, the income, and other factors. And therefore, you see a tremendous flattening in terms of where the money goes, where the benefit goes, who is ending up with warmer, more comfortable homes. And you can imagine that the difference that makes in social terms in terms of the goal to make people's lives healthier and more comfortable, as well as reducing emissions. But you can also imagine what it does in political terms, in terms of the perceptions of fairness. This is how taxpayers' money is being spent, who is benefiting from that, why are we doing it, and there's a real difference there. Ireland, by the way, has very similar distinctions. I was just looking at the SEAI website the other day. Ireland has spent €1 billion on home retrofits in the last 5 years. 250,000 homes have benefited, and the biggest group by far to benefit are the so-called energy poor households. So there's a real progressive logic in the programs, but also 250,000. What's that? 1 in 7 or 8 homes. So everybody has a neighbor, a friend, a family member who has. This is now becoming normal. It's becoming something to envy, something to see that this is a positive engagement, and this is what clean energy programs can really look like. And that's why I think that question of designing for fairness is so important. So I talk about these 3 principles around just what we term people-centered clean energy transitions, a focus on people, and an understanding that we can and need to align questions of emissions in themselves with wider goals for why energy policy exists around affordability, access, comfort, and energy security. And let's not leave out energy security, particularly in these difficult times, in terms of the importance of aligning our goals there. And now I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the work we're doing in multilateral forums around this. And I want to leave you with the message that multilateral still matters in these issues. And Ireland's participation there is really important. So first of all, we've been working with the G20, and last year's Brazilian-led G20 adopted. Very little was agreed in last year's G20, by the way. It was some interesting meetings to be at in Brazil. And one of the few things that was agreed, and to my pleasant surprise, was a set of voluntary principles for just and inclusive energy transitions that were negotiated by energy ministers and then signed off by the G20 leaders late last year. They're not perfect. Some of the language is a little bit fuzzy, but I think it's a major historic breakthrough for all G20 countries to say, we believe in the concept of just and inclusive energy transitions, and we want to set out what that means in some detail. And you can see that there's a lot of really important principles there to lock in, and I think that was quite an achievement. We worked very closely with the G20 presidency on that process through an engagement the IIEA hosts called the Global Commission on People-Centered Clean Energy Transitions. And it's made up of energy and climate ministers from about a dozen countries. It's led by Teresa Ribeira and Alexandra Silveira, the Brazilian minister. It has a bunch of ministers from other parts of the world and a bunch of civil society people ranging from youth, gender representation, indigenous communities, labor and business and so on. And we work with these people to get their experience and their perspectives to really flesh out what do we mean by a simple term, people-centered transitions. What does that mean when you break it out into separate components, and how do you deliver that on the ground? And that's the moment we're at now, having agreed these high-level principles, which sound great, but how does that turn into action on the ground? And that's exactly the question we are working on this year in G20, which is led by South Africa, which has a great commitment to this process to turn the high-level principles I just showed you into a more detailed blueprint for action in terms of how this works on the ground. And I want to pause here and say a little bit about the multilateral process, because this was something that was quite new to me before I moved to Paris, but I've been working with about 10 G20s now, and each one is different and achieves different things and focuses on different things. But the last 3 or 4 have been really interesting, because the last 4 presidencies, each year that a country takes on the presidency, they really drive the process, they decide the priorities, and they determine whether it succeeds or not through their endeavors. The last 4 have been led by Indonesia, India, Brazil last year, and South Africa this year. And it's really been important to have that Southern leadership driving the process to make this really feel like a global process. And I think Brazil has very high ambition for what they want to do with their presidency of G20, with their presidency of COP. They achieved a lot in G20. And we have this really nice line for this work going from agreeing the principles in G20 last year, taking it into a blueprint for action in this year's G20, when the ministers will meet in September, and then taking the road to Belém in November, where we will see Brazil's leadership once again in COP30. On COP30, we had a meeting a couple of weeks ago with André de Lago, who's the incoming COP president, and he was very much central to Brazil's G20 presidency as well. He's a really strong diplomat, and Brazil's leadership has been really important in the last couple of years. And I think we're in as safe as hands as we possibly could be in these times with André de Lago as the COP president. And some of you may have seen he's issued his first presidency letter, which sets out some of the principles. And it really builds on Brazil's strong commitment to multilateralism, to progressive politics, to engagement, and to delivering for people. It's going to be a challenging year, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in both G20 and COP30. The idea of consensus is different in 2025. But I will say to you that I've seen many presidencies find ways to deliver important outcomes that aren't based on total consensus and total unanimity, and I'm optimistic for both of those processes this year. Here's my little advertorial. So here's some of the work we're doing on this, and happy to engage with anybody on this, some of the steps on the journey around these people-centered clean energy transitions this year. On our side, some of you know that we host an annual conference on energy efficiency everywhere, somewhere in the world. Last year was in Nairobi. This year is actually our 10th anniversary. Makes me feel old, in Brussels. And that will be led by our Executive Director, Fatih Birol, and the new Energy Commissioner in Brussels, Dan Jorgensen. And because it's the 10th anniversary, it will be a big moment. It's building on the COP28 success, where the world agreed to a doubling target for energy efficiency. And we'll have a lot of people gathering there. But we'll be seeing everything through a social lens. So we'll use the opportunity that a lot of ministers and other key stakeholders are coming to Brussels. We will host the next commission of our Global Commission on People-Centered Transitions, and also our platform called the Clean Energy Labour Council, where we bring together union leaders from around the world to engage in these issues. And that's also a very important platform for us. In July, we'll be working with Anne Hidalgo, the Mayor of Paris, to host a global youth summit, which is looking specifically at this journey from Paris to Belém. And we'll be co-organizing that with the Brazilian leadership of COP30 to look at the youth participation and the youth input into COP on that journey. And I think Belém is going to be very important in many ways. And of course, then we see the main set pieces in September in South Africa, and November in COP30 in a small town in northern Brazil called Belém. So what I want to end by saying is, in terms of Ireland's position, Ireland is a guest country of G20 this year for the first time ever, and I think that's fantastic. I'm really pleased. Makes me proud as an Irish person. But I also think it's strategically very wise for Ireland to have taken up that position, because it's already finding itself in daily meetings with Australian officials, Canadian officials, American officials, Brazilian officials, and it's really putting Ireland on the global stage in terms of its engagement. Also giving Ireland a chance to stand up and identify what it believes in terms of the progressive agenda, the clean energy agenda, and across many other areas well beyond energy and climate. And what I really want to say is, I'm sure I'm going to be asked any second now, what does multilateralism mean? Is there such a thing as multilateralism in 2025? And what I want to say to you, it's certainly changed. We're entering a new era, but I really believe multilateralism is more important than ever. And it's a crucial moment for multilateralism. And the fact that Ireland is now playing a role in that, I think is really important and something we should all champion. So let me close there and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Terrific, Brian. Almost uplifting, if I can say
That's
that.
as good as it gets.
As good as it gets. Just a lot. I mean, I'm sure there'll be many questions. One thing that just where you finished on multilateralism, and you hardly mentioned the US. I'm not sure if you mentioned the US at all. I don't know if that was purpose on or otherwise. But again, that was to some extent a bit of a relief. But I wonder, would you just briefly reflect on not necessarily just all of the political stuff that's happening in the US, opening that, but after Paris, of course, there was the first Trump presidency and the withdrawal. We remember that back to a previous era of Kyoto, that was an earlier kind of similar kind of impact. There was a lot of pessimism at that stage in 2016 when they did pull out, but the momentum, it seems to me that the lesson from what you're saying, or the message from what you're saying, is the momentum continued. And you, I think, again, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think that's really largely what you're saying now. The expectation, certainly the hope and grounds for expecting that the momentum will continue, even with the absence of, at least at the rhetorical level of the US, because it seems, again, I'll go on, but the question, I often think with the Trump presidency, it's often rhetorical, the contempt for the process. Because, of course, there's an investment trajectory happening in the US anyway. There are lots of things happening that can't be stopped, and perhaps nobody wants to stop. But the rhetoric is sort of the other side of that coin. So would you just briefly say just your final point of multilateralism? Yes, but what about the US? People would be saying, surely their absence or their current position will necessarily have an adverse impact on that.
Thank you, Alex. I mean, I need to start by saying, first of all, the IEA is a member-driven organization. Yeah. We work for 32 governments, including the US, and we work to their priorities. And we look forward to working with the Trump administration as we did before. And we're well used. The IEA is 50.5 years old, and we're well used to countries having very different positions on many different issues. We're already seeing what the US still is emphasizing in energy terms, and wants to continue driving its leadership on around energy security, affordability, access, certain technologies. We're also hearing, yes, that their view is very different on some areas around climate and related matters. How that affects things on the ground, we don't know yet. It really is too early to tell, but I mean, it will change things, and I think certainly, and I don't want to focus entirely on the US, because I think we're just in a different period in terms around consensus among the big players and things like that. Getting consensus decision on anything in these major platforms has always been difficult, and I think we can all anticipate it's more difficult now.
Sure, absolutely. Questions? Yes, right there. Can I just have an indication of who might like to ask a question so that I have a good sense? Broadly speaking, yes.
Thanks very much. Jean Moore from the National Economic and Social Council. Just to say, 2012, we were doing work on climate change. I remember chatting to Brian about the social and behavioural aspects of climate change, and it was a really important part as a fellow sociologist and psychologist as well. And just to say, years later now, UNESCO is doing a body work on energy, and I've been doing a piece on households and energy communities. And just to say, your light is still shining, because it's very much looking at a people-centered approach. And I suppose my question is, we have principles of a just transition in our climate action plan, and Eamon and Ryan will be very familiar with those. And if we were to adopt people-centered principles in our energy policy, how would you recommend that they be embedded and animated? Because we seem to be good at maybe having them, but not necessarily really fully using them and embedding them. So I know the roadmap is still to come, but that's just my question. Thank you.
I'm inclined to take two together, just so that we can move things. Yes, sir. If you could give your name and just say where you're from, as indeed you did, but just to remind people.
Hi, Eamon Conway from a business called Healthy Home Check. I would know Brian from my previous role in Climate. A couple of things, Brian, just get your perspective on, while I've got the mic, I might ask two things. Heat pump retrofits strikes me as one of the main challenges is the price of electricity to the consumer relative to fossil fuels. in the transition. And you've a view as to how policy could be evolved to facilitate that for a quicker uptake. And the second part of the energy efficiency piece, which I think is possibly underrepresented, is the link to the wider ventilation and the sort of, you mentioned it there, but indoor air quality. And under directives like EPBD, do you see a role for where the energy assessment could be widened to cover those other aspects that would be important to consumers?
Thank you. We should also say that questions from people I haven't known for 20 years are welcome too, right? Just to check. Jean, to your question, thank you. Well, first of all, let's not premise that Ireland's climate policies and related energy policies are not built on people-centered principles, whatever they're called. I think they are. I think there's a very social focus here. And as I say, I think certain colleagues in the room have been wise in terms of the investment in things like rural transport, home retrofit, energy poverty, where these are things that should feel like typical examples of what clean energy transitions mean, you know, and I think that's been done. But it gets framed then in terms of the people stuff is over here and the climate stuff is over here. And I see that in many governments. And some of this, it'll come back to Eamon's question as well. Governments like to break things up. So there's a department of net zero and there's a department of making people's lives better and the department of something else over here. And they don't always feel fully integrated. And of course, there's always a difference between the debate happening on the ground and how it should be. And some of that is because these things are complicated and how they feel and people have genuine concerns. They hear different things. But of course, also the debates get manipulated and by vested interests, and let's not forget that. I'll just use the question to talk a little bit about behavior change, because we track behavior change campaigns around the world and we track how they're done and what kind of impact they have. And I can summarize several years' work and say they're mostly terrible. Because people, first of all, they treat people as kind of widgets to say, I wish you did this instead of this, so I need to find a clever way to get you to do this. And I think in my view, we treat people too much as individuals rather than communities and societies, because we want to change norms. We want to change the way society works, not just get one person to volunteer to do A instead of B, even if it's inconvenient. And most campaigns are I'd like to characterize them. They're either something on the side of a bus that says, did you know you could save 4.27% of your energy if you change the flanges in your boiler, or something, and as if we're all these kind of rational actors. Or they're of the kind of type that says, hey, I was in a soap opera 20 years ago and I'm here to tell you about attic insulation, you know, and kind of the science of engaging people is still, well, the science is much richer than governments make use of, let me put it that way. On heat pumps and that, these are technical issues, but there's a really interesting dynamic across Europe, because this is all about heat pumps save a huge amount of energy and usually a huge amount of carbon, but they don't necessarily save the consumer any money because it depends on the relative price of gas and electricity. And so, for instance, if you put a heat pump in Sweden, it'll halve your electricity bill. If you put a heat pump in the UK, your electricity, if you put a heat pump in Sweden, your spend on your heat will halve. If you do it in London, your spend will go up. Now, these are complicated issues, because I don't want to just say you should bring down the price of electricity. I guess we could all say that, but there are other dynamics in pricing. But I think thinking about the market design and relative pricing is really important now, because I do think in some cases we have legacy systems and thinking that weren't designed for the pace of change and transitions. And again, Eamon, to your point around the directive and things like that, I just feel that so much of climate response is around much more joined up thinking in governments, where we don't split everything up and say this ministry does that. Governments do that naturally for very understandable reasons, but we have to have much more holistic views. And that's why I think in the case of Ireland, the overarching law, the overarching strategy, the institutional structures really create the potential to do things better in terms of impact, but also in terms of making sure the social dimensions are there too.
Down the back, very back. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. And I'm Francesca Insabato, Environment Sustainability Coordinator for Concern Worldwide. And I represent the humanitarian sector here. Now, at a time where multilateral humanitarian assistance is actually at a critical turn, we face a challenge because we are trying to still deliver on life-saving humanitarian assistance and climate action, but with constrained funding. So my question would be, do you see any innovative mechanisms or avenues to raise funds for humanitarian organizations that are willing to invest on clean energy projects or climate action in collaboration with governments, or any other possible insight on your side? Thank you.
Just to forget, I know there's another question here, but just 2 rows in front of, yeah, that gentleman there with the glasses. Yeah, just because he's nearby. Yeah, and then I'll come up here.
Hi, thank you, Brian. It was a great talk. My name is Kshitij. I'm from KA Advisors. I just want to pick your brain on something. You touched about people-focused transition, and then we have a big pushback in all over Europe. It's not only Ireland, but from the industries on the name of the competitiveness. Do you think, is there a way, or how competitiveness can be solved, or not fully solved, but then partially addressed through people-focused transition, how they can collaborate together? Or should we start looking at the things outside our boundaries? Because that's a biggest challenge right now, I think.
Sure. Yep, thank you.
Thank you. Both good questions. On the first question, I think this is not my expertise, but Eamon was with us a few months ago where we held a big summit on clean cooking, and the whole discussion around carbon markets was really important there, and carbon financing, because this is a personal view just because it's not my space, but there's a bit of in clean cooking. Clean cooking is a terrible, terrible problem. It's a social problem. It's easily soluble. It's solvable by what I'm going to describe as a few billion quid, right? It's not difficult. We just need to fund helping people change over to cleaner, more modern cooking systems. And yet we still have barriers to getting that funding flowing. And one of the challenges, it's not the only challenge, but one of the challenges here is that it's not amenable to carbon market funding because it's not very verifiable, because you don't know how much carbon it's going to save, you don't know how people are going to behave, and it's hard to count. And a lot of Western investors and Western companies, because they're under the cosh to make sure there's no greenwashing and they're spending their carbon and climate funding on legitimate things, shy away from funding clean cooking because they're afraid they're going to be criticized because they said they bought a million credits, but actually it's only 500,000 because not so much carbon was saved. And yet this strange paradox happens then, because women and children continue to work in these, and it's mostly women and children, which is why I identify it that way. And so there's kind of this mismatch between the social good of that outcome and the counting of the carbon is something that troubles me. I'm simplifying it a bit there, but just I wanted to mention that. On the competitiveness and that, I mean, again, I just want to say that there should be no sense of opposition between energy security and transitions, competitiveness and transitions, affordability and transitions. All of these things can be aligned together. I think Europe is doing some very good thinking on this. I think the Draghi report is really good and has some really good ideas. I think the new college in the Commission has some really good ideas. In Europe, implementation, coherent implementation is always a challenge. So let's see. But I think the idea of Europe saying we've really got to focus on competitiveness and affordability, but in a way that we stick to our guns on climate and clean energy because we believe in it and we see the alignment, I think that's really important.
Mm-hmm. Question here. Did I see another, before you start, did I see another hand in this area here?
The ambassador.
Ambassador, of course, yeah. Come up here then. These two. Thanks, Kieran.
Claire Duffy, ESB. I just wanted to ask you around net zero fuels, and I was wondering if you might share with us some of the trends that the IEA is seeing. So very much when we look at the increased penetration of renewables, we're still going to need that backup dispatchable energy, be it in ESB, we're looking at grid scale batteries and ultimately perhaps using offshore to generate green hydrogen. But we are seeing, issues that's dependent on offshore, but we're seeing elsewhere perhaps the hydro-treated vegetable oils, or are we seeing Saudi Aramco ramping up with e-fuel partnerships? Just interested to see the trends that the IEA are seeing around that net zero fuel piece to provide the dispatchable backup energy. Thanks.
Hello, Aslak Bryn, Norwegian Ambassador. I wonder if you could say something more about energy security. I mean, after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, that's really been very high on people's mind. You have done some analysis on that as IEA, I know, but also in terms of how you look from a first point about we have to frame this right. seems to me that, renewable energy is local. So if we accelerate the change towards renewable energy, some of the concerns we have now about, the energy security will also then be less important than it is today. So your comment, please.
Yeah, thank you. I'll start there and good if you. I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And I think sometimes, as I said, we've seen maybe people trying to create an opposition between energy security and clean energy transitions. I think Europe did realize, in the last couple of years that we wish we'd invested more in efficiency in the last decade. So it only takes half as much energy to heat an efficient home as an inefficient home. We wish we'd invested more in our local resources, particularly as an energy importing region. It's a kind of a no-brainer, whatever your motivation is. And I think that, but also, say, coming from the energy efficiency perspective, we had Europe coming to us and saying, what can we do in the next 6 weeks to make the world more efficient? And I was saying, well, if you're starting 10 years ago, I can tell you what to do, but there is stuff you can do in the short term, but it doesn't happen overnight. But I think it has recalibrated. And we absolutely believe that there's no misalignment between energy security and clean energy transitions. But I think it's really important not to let that framing stick, because energy security is very important to people's lives and well-being, but also in the debate here, because if there's a sense that moving to renewables makes my energy less secure or risks the lights going off or something like that, then nobody's going to support that. And you see that in the global debate. There's what I'll describe as a very healthy global debate about e-fuels and biofuels and all that. But nobody disagrees with the premise that we need to think about dispatchability, and therefore whether it's hydrogen or e-fuels, they're really important. And of course, traditional biofuels. And we're seeing that actually in the G20 right now, because we had India and then Brazil, who are both really interested in biofuels in terms of both first generation and second generation. There's been a lot of hype as well, let's be honest as well. The amount of ideas for hydrogen versus about 1% of all hydrogen projects have moved to FID in the last couple of years. And I see the importance of hydrogen. I see some sectors that it can really get into quickly, like obviously intensive industry, shipping maybe. I don't see it in home heating. I really find it very hard to believe the economics are going to stack up with that. But maybe I'll be wrong. And countries, and I should stress always, countries make their own decisions on these matters. They make their own policy choices. But I think there's a lot of interest in those areas, and there's a lot of work going on by the IEA and in these multilateral forums as well.
Coming up close enough to it. Oh, yes. Yes, there. Yeah. And just again, any indications of anybody who might like to ask a question? Yes. Okay. There'll be another. So one here and one right back down the corner. Yes, sir.
Hi, Robert from Department of Transport. I was wondering if you could talk about the social elements and the just transition aspect in relation to the amount of materials and minerals that we might need to fully decarbonize. I think when we add up all the resource requirements for solar PVs, for wind farms, for the grid, for the batteries, for the EVs, for the heat pumps, there almost seems to be a limit on the amount of resources. So I was wondering if the IEA has done any analysis on the material requirements and what your take on that is. Thank you.
I'll let you start into that answer, because the next questioner is, I think it's Adrian, right down the corner. So to give you a chance to go down, maybe you might start.
Yeah, again, this is a huge debate at the moment around critical minerals and resources. We're doing a lot of work on this in terms of it's a dimension, it's a formal dimension of our energy security work, but also analytically in terms of the resources. To be honest, I would start by saying I don't know that we're going to run out of stuff that quickly. I want to start by saying that if you look at how much stuff we dig out of the ground, if we move away from oil and coal, we're going to be digging infinitely less out of the ground stuff, tonnage terms, than we will be in the future. Critical minerals will grow very, very significantly, but the scale is still fundamentally different. And there will be resources in terms of the limitations. We do a lot of work with governments on questions like circularity. How you build a car matters. How you recycle the materials coming out of a battery or a wind turbine really matters. And that's really important to make maximum use and to get a real recycling ethic in there. The two short-term risks I concern most about critical minerals is the supply chain security issue, because the vast majority of these minerals, and in particular their processing, comes from one country. And that's a major security risk that governments need to be taking seriously, and I think they are taking seriously. And secondly, to go back to people-centered history dimension, there's what I call a gold rush, which I kind of mean semi-literally, towards getting more minerals out of the ground. And for good reasons in terms of climate, clean energy, deploying clean energy solutions. That can't mean we lower our standards in terms of how we do that, in terms of mining, resource extraction, processing. And I worry that the pressure for scale can lead to the risk of bad practice, you know, in that regard. And if we're talking about people-centeredness in energy projects and in energy infrastructure, we can't then ignore it in the alternatives we're moving towards.
Adrian?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Adrienne Ferguson here, Communications Director at the IIEA. And I suppose you spoke earlier, Brian, about that pillar in the importance of a positive vision. And then at the same time, you were talking about SEAI figures that there's 250,000 homes retrofitted last year or in the last how many years. And it kind of struck me that I don't really know that information, you know, and I'm sure that's not for the lack of the SEI promoting that as much as possible, everyone talking about it. And I think there's really, you know, the negativity towards the clean transition, the communications around that, you know, it's too expensive, it's not fast enough, you know, it's not ambitious enough. I'm just wondering, do you have examples or you know, of strategies or other companies or countries that really managed to kind of jump past that negativity, that obstacle, and maybe bring the public along with them towards that positive vision, you know? And you talked again about bringing people beyond policy, which is such a powerful idea, you know? So interested to hear from you on that.
Good question to combine with that is John Martin on the Zoom, the Q&A. To what extent does Brian think the climate brand, as John described it, has gone out of favor in the last 12 months globally? How much do we need to switch towards leveraging co-benefits of the clean transition? You touched on earlier in terms of air quality, for example, the London example that you gave, affordability, quality of life, just transition. So it's kind of linked to Adrian's question.
I mean, I think that's the essence of my message is that, first of all, I think, yes, the climate brand is having a hard time. I think it's under attack. You know, in the German elections recently, one of the right-wing parties said the two things we're most against are immigration and heat pumps. So, you know, that's kind of the strange world we live in now. And as I say, some of that is kind of, the risk is always there, but I do think some cases governments could have communicated these things a lot better in a joined up way. And I think to answer both the questions, I think we really have to see clean energy transitions as part of societal progress and development and our vision for our society. It's not like we have an industrial policy over here, we have a housing policy over here, we have an education policy over here. But by the way, we have some targets to meet, otherwise we'll be fined or Brussels will be crossed, and that is a technical issue we have to deal with. We have to see it as a positive vision. And the countries that I see doing that best, this means that sometimes you make climate decisions that are not, if you just cared about the ton of carbon, we wouldn't choose that option, or you wouldn't spend the money there. But if you care about it in a way that benefits our, you know, inherent strengths best, or our current conditions, or our current workforce. And I see countries in Europe saying, we're choosing this technology and this resource because it's much easier for workers in fossil fuel to transition to that, or that's closer to our own strengths or our own culture or whatever else. And I think doing that in a positive vision way, I mean, and again, what's the alternative? What, we're going to not do climate? We're going to be, you know, a carbon intensive society. We're going to be trying to sell stuff that has much more carbon embedded, that is unsustainable. We're going to continue our dependence on billions and billions of fossil fuel imports. You know what I mean? I think this is about a future vision that wraps everything together in a positive way.
Sure. I think I'm going to steal about 5 minutes more, if that's all right. We always promise to have people out at the appointed hour, 2 o'clock, but we just take an extra 5 minutes, if that's all right. Are there others? I've 1 or 2 questions online. Are there anybody else in the room like to? There's one here, just again to indicate. All right, so you might be the last one in the room. And actually, I'll leave you the microphone in case somebody changes their mind, and I'll just throw you 1 or 2 that have come in online. Dan O'Brien is wondering what your views are on the role of LNG in the transition to net zero, both globally and in Ireland. And Mark Lynch, who's Dublin South County Greens, could you expand on the challenges of the exponential increase in demand for electricity due to data centres and other factors which could outstrip the increase in generation from renewables? So that's LNG and data centres, 2 very easy ones. And in the room,
are you sure we have 5 more minutes?
I know. Well, the thing is, with 3 questions, it's always open to the to the speaker to choose the ones that he likes best, especially since we're up on the air, up on time. Yes.
But in the interest of efficiency, my 3 is knocked down to 2 because they've been covered already.
the speakers online.
Oh, I see. Your questions are covered. All right, that's great. Brian.
Well, thank you for those questions. And I know both
Yes.
of these are controversial in Ireland, so I do have to say we work for governments, including Ireland, so I'm not here to tell Ireland what it should or shouldn't do. And it's important to stress that. They are both controversial and they're not clear cut. Let me start with data centres. Ireland is in this strange position. It's got a really healthy tech sector. It's really important. And coming with that is those companies want to build their data centres here. In most countries in the world, the electricity demand for data centers represents 2% of their electricity system. Here it's over 20. So it's fair to have that debate about the different policy imperatives. And again, the more joined up it is, because I can certainly imagine a world where data centers, where there's a bigger demand for data centers powered by renewables, but that comes at a cost. It means you have to build infrastructure. It's not free. It has a political dimension, because I see coverage now where I see people saying, it's one thing asking me to have a wind farm in my neighborhood to power our homes, but it feels different if you ask me to have a wind farm in my neighborhood to power a data center that I don't feel any connection to. So I think there are difficult decisions there, and same with LNG, because again, I want to really stress that we need to keep energy security first and foremost in our minds. It hasn't gone away. There's a place for fossil fuels. Let's not be, let's understand that that transitions need to be orderly and secure and take time. Whether LNG is the right decision for Ireland or not is not for me to say, but I think we have to take seriously these competing pressures and have a mature debate around that.
Okay. Brian, thank you very much for that excursion, first of all, in the presentation and where we are 10 years on, or almost 10 years on. But also, I think more compellingly, your willingness to look forward into the next 10 years. I mean, when we were in Paris in 2015 and talking about 2030, it's 15 years since, and we've gone through 2/3 of that period since. It's amazing to think that. So I remember being on a radio program one time talking about 2050 and just being almost sort of slagged out of the studio, like, how can you talk about 2050? When even is that? The presenter said, so like, but these timelines, they do catch up, and they are catching up. But it's been great the way you've demonstrated the progress that's been made, not just kept hope alive. I think you've done more than that, shown that it's not just a kind of a whimsical hope, but that there's real, genuine progress being made, and the groundwork there for huge things to be done in the coming years. So just once again, thanks very much to Brian Motherway.
Thank you.
And thank you in particular to everybody in the room and those of you who've been watching online for your attendance. And we look forward to seeing you all again very soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.